One of the things that we regularly do when developing in Cake PHP is to run bin cake. And bin cake gives us a whole bunch of command line utilities to do a whole heap of rapid development and management of their Cake PHP application. But one thing that's nice to have, and we can demonstrate not having it here by just entering bin cake and then pressing tab a couple of times. One thing that's nice to have is auto completion of the top level commands and the sub commands available to us when we use bin cake. So let's get this working. At the moment I'm inside a Windows Subsystem for Linux Ubuntu installation, but how do we install it? So if we have a look in our bin directory and have a look at the bash completion shell script, and just want the top, maybe 8 lines of the file. Notice what it says here. It says copy this bash completion shell script into this directory and name it cake. So we can do that by copying bin bash completion into, and we can copy it there and call it cake. Now in order to get that running, we have to create a new login shell. So the easiest way to do that in WSL is just close the terminal and reopen it, and then go back to our Cake PHP project, and then when we go bin cake, notice that we now have our completion working, and if we put a top level command in, it then auto suggests the next level, and it works quite well. So that's getting it working just in a default Linux environment. But oftentimes what you'll find, and this is the case in my development setup, is that I'm running Docker containers, and I do most of my development out of the PHP container. So I connect VS Code to the PHP container and develop from there. So let's do that. So launching VS Code, and it opens the last thing. So in our extensions we need remote containers, and we need Docker installed in VS Code as well in the parent installation of VS Code. And once we've got that, we can connect to our container, but we're already connected in here because you can see it down the bottom here. We're in the container already. So how do we get this particular completion working in a container? Now this container is the default Docker container built by the PHP people, and it uses Debian. And if we go into etc and go ls, there's nothing in there that sings out and says there's bash completion included as part of the image. So you can verify that by doing a dpackage -l, which is a list command, and grep out for completion, and you can see that it's not there. So first thing we can do is do an update of the package list in the container, and then apt-get install, and the package name we're looking for is bash completion, and then we can just say yes. So there we've installed bash completion into our container. Now it says here to copy this file as cake into this directory, but if we look in etc, that directory, there's a new cake bash completion file here, but there's no bash completion D. So let's create that directory, and then follow the direction, which is copy bash completion into etc bash_completion.d, and name it cake. Now I've made multiple attempts to get this working. I tried restarting the extension host, so basically restarting all the VS Code processes, and then going back into my environment, and then using bin cake and every time it would just continue to do this, so it wouldn't load the bash completion. And the reason for that is, and we can verify this quite easily by looking at the results of looking at our WSL terminal. It says it's a login shell, and if we do the same thing in our VS Code instance, it says not a login shell. So when it's a login shell, it will source the correct files to enable auto completion. When it's not a login shell, it will bypass that and it won't source the files to make auto completion work. So how do we get, when we start a new terminal within VS Code, how do we get that new terminal to be a login shell? Well, we can do that by going into our settings. Now we've got a number of different settings, places we can make settings changes, but probably the best one is the workspace setting for this particular case, because it will create a directory in our source code which will then survive the destruction of each container. So we'll go into our workspace settings here, and notice as soon as we do that, it creates a directory called VS Code and settings. And the next thing we have to do is we're going to override the default terminal launch for the VS Code integrated terminal. So integrated profiles, and notice it's got there the option for Linux. So I'm just going to press enter now, and it gives us a whole bunch of different profiles that we can then modify. Now the default profile is the bash profile. As you can see down here, it's the default profile that we'll be launching. So we can go into here and we can say, alright, so we want to add some args, and the arg we want to add is the -l arg. And why do we want to do that? Well, if we run bash here with a -l, that then makes it into a login shell, and at that point, if we go bin cake and then double tab, it now includes autocomplete because it's picked up the correct files when it's launched. So we've made a change here. We've changed our settings JSON for this workspace to have -l. Let's now launch another terminal and see if that's stuck. So bin cake, couple of tabs, and then we can see that it's now working just the way we want it to. And it's now auto-completing nicely there for us. So that's how to get auto-completion working on Linux and Docker container using VS Code.